Okay, well, welcome everyone to the 2021-2022 Community Legislative Committee meeting. We had started this legislative committee back in 2016, and our first speaker that we had at that time, as I was going through my notes from the last 5 years, was Suffolk County Legislator Kate Browning, who kicked it off for us. And here tonight we have Ryan Ruff, who's going to kick it off for us for starting our 6th year here. I'd just like to thank everyone for being here tonight and making it possible for us to continue this legislative committee, and hoping that one day we'll get out of Zooming and meet everybody back in person again. I guess we will now have the Pledge of Allegiance. Yes, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Dr. Lutz, would you like to introduce our special speaker tonight?
Yeah, I absolutely would. Thank you very much, everybody. So I would just say that if you're not speaking, feel free to mute yourself so we don't have audio feedback. And later on, when we do questions and answers, you can either unmute or post them below in the chat. So I'm really grateful to be able to introduce Mr. Ryan Ruff. We always try to get an important message out in our first meeting of the year. So we had a very unusual year in regards to funding for schools. And we know as a BOCES that funding for schools impact what happens with us. So I thought it was very appropriate for Ryan to be able to update us all on what happened last spring and how it's impacting this school year. Let me just tell you a little bit about Ryan for those of you who don't know him, although he's frequently at these meetings, so many of you may know him. But Ryan Ruff is the Deputy Superintendent for Management Services at Eastern Suffolk BOCES. He's been at the agency for the past 6.5 years. Prior to coming to Eastern Suffolk BOCES, Ryan was the Assistant Superintendent for Business at Plainview Old Bethpage Central School District for 9 years, and then several other districts before that. He believes in strong business practices that create efficiencies while protecting taxpayers' funds. He does many things at Eastern Suffolk BOCES, but in his present position, one of the things that he does is pays very close attention to our budget, to our expenditures, to how they're impacting districts, as well as all of the oversight of our 1 million square feet of space, and all of our different buildings and offices. So it's a really big job. But tonight he's not here to talk about what he does for BOCES. He's here to talk about state aid and how that impacts schools. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ryan, just to let people know if you're new to this format. If you don't want to look at lots of little squares and you just want to look at the speaker, just click in your right up hand, the right upper corner of your screen, click yourself to speaker view and you will see Ryan, or he's going to share his screen. So you're going to see his PowerPoint for a good part of the meeting. So go ahead, Ryan. And thank you again for your willingness to do this.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lutz. So let me just share my screen here, get the PowerPoint set up. Okay, perfect, thanks. So tonight, what we're going to discuss is we're going to take a look at funding for public schools and how this was impacted during the pandemic. And we're going to take a few slides and take another look at some budget impact survey information that we think would be kind of interesting to share. So just very basic, most of you know this, but where do school districts receive their money from? And there's two primary sources that districts get their funds for that supports their annual budgets. The first is state aid. So this is money that comes directly from New York State's budget that's paid to each and every school district in New York State individually. That's done based on the wealth of the school district. That's the primary indicator of how much aid you would get. So if you're a less wealthy district, you'll get more aid. The more wealth you have in your district, you'll get less amount of aid. The second source is property taxes. Property taxes, as I'm sure most of you know, is the amount of money that a homeowner will pay or a business owner will pay to support the school district budget. And reference would be the actual tax levy. What's interesting and specific to BOCES is that we don't receive any state aid directly. We do get BOCES aid that gets sent to us that we then allocate to the districts that utilize our services. So the vast majority of our revenue at BOCES, and this is all true with all BOCES across the state, is funds that come directly from school districts for the school districts that sign up for our services. So what happened during the pandemic for school districts? So if we take a look at last year, the 2021 school year, there were a lot of additional unbudgeted expenses. And the reason these expenses were unbudgeted is largely due to the fact of timing. So school districts didn't have the opportunity in March of 20 to add additional funds into their 2021 school budgets because the budget process was pretty much completed. In addition to that, if you think back to March of 20, we really didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. And most school districts at that time, you only had about a couple of weeks to act. Certainly didn't anticipate that it would last this long. So there was lots of additional expenses in school districts' budgets. A lot of districts added additional staffing. There was a tremendous amount of money spent for overtime with cleaning. There was additional disinfecting that took place throughout schools. We've all now are familiar with the term PPE. There was considerable amount of expenses for supplies in nurses' offices and masks and disinfectant and a whole host of things that fell within that category. Also dividers, right? Most student desks and office spaces receive these dividers to help try to prevent the spread of the virus. A lot of school districts did major upgrades to their heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. And the reason for that is they were trying to really achieve the highest level of filtration possible to try to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Another large area that most districts had no choices on, but was to purchase a lot of technology to support remote instruction. So there's a massive amount of money spent with one-to-one device initiatives and also all the back-end support for those technology purchases as well. As you could imagine, there's borrowing expenses that were associated with that. So to bring it home to BOCES, how much money that we spent that we've been tracking since the pandemic began was about $2.4 million related to COVID expenses. So the question is where did that money come from? What did school districts do? How did they make up for that if they weren't able to budget for that? So at the same time of additional expenses, there were also a lot of savings in the budgets, right? So if you think back to last fall and throughout the year, there were limited athletics. So there was a lot of savings there, right? You didn't have coaches, you didn't have referees, you didn't have transportation running to the sporting events or security. So there's savings there. A lot of after school opportunities didn't occur in last school year. Most field trips didn't take place. And there was limited transportation as well, especially for schools that were on AB day schedules. But even with these examples of savings, it certainly didn't offset all of the additional expenses associated with the coronavirus. So what happened was at the United States level or at the federal level, there were three major programs that took place to support public education across the country. The first that many of you have probably heard of is referred to as the CARES Act. And this happened very early on in the pandemic. It was an allocation of $1.1 billion, and it was to run for a limited amount of time. Suffolk County got about $29 million. And what New York State did with this, if you recall, is they actually reduced the amount of state aid to school districts, and then they backfilled it with this federal program. So this first program that we talk about didn't have the same level of impact that would have been, it wasn't really additional money. It backfilled money that New York State had to cut out of their support to school districts because they weren't receiving the same amount of revenues that they had due to the pandemic and the shutting down of the economy. So with the CARES Act, there was certain purchases that you could make, such as cleaning supplies, educational technologies, mental health services, and support for online learning. So that was the first federal allocation that we saw to support public education. The second is the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriation. And this was bigger. It was approved in December of 2020, almost $4 billion in this. And you can see that the allocation to Suffolk County grew considerably. It's about $192 million. So this had the same support in terms of what types of items that you could buy and with these federal dollars. But the nice thing about this is there wasn't an offset from New York State. So this was true additional funds in support for school districts. And it also extended the timeline to September of 22. So we see we have almost another year for the use of these funds. The third group is referred to as the American Rescue Plan. And that was approved in March of 21. And this was the largest allocation. It was $8.2 billion, again, extended the timeline. Suffolk County received a lot more money under this, about $315 million. What New York State did with this allocation is they added some additional requirements. So they made sure that there was spending that was spread out over each year of this program at a minimum of 12.5%. And the way they allocated this funding source was based on Title I counts. And Title I has a relation to low-income families. So the beauty of this program is it drove the dollars to the places that really needed it the most. So an additional requirement under this third federal program was a focus on learning loss. So summer programs, before and after school programs, and trying to get students the additional resources that they missed during remote learning time. So that was 3 federal programs that had a really, really nice impact for public education. And we're going to see the impact of that over the next few years. So we're going to shift now and just talk a little bit about a school budget impact survey. So on Long Island, there's a group of stakeholders that are involved in public education that is referred to as the Long Island Education Coalition. So the groups that are represented at that table are superintendents, PTA members, teachers union, school business officials, leaderships from BOCES. And what's happened over the course of the last 11 years is that they've done a survey that gets pushed out to all school districts on Long Island to collect data so that we can use that information to help advocate with our elected officials so that when they can have a better understanding for the needs of public education, specifically on Long Island. So it's much stronger to provide data points to advocacy as opposed to just statements. This chart here provides the demographics on Long Island broken into categories based on wealth. So if you look at the left-hand column, you see the different categories that we refer to as low wealth, low mid-wealth, high wealth, and something referred to as no common wealth ratio, or I'm sorry, combined wealth ratio. So in New York State, every school district is assigned a CWR. And if you have less than 1, that means you have less than the average amount of wealth for a school district, not on Long Island, but across the entire state. So the next column over provides the student enrollment by the school districts that responded to our survey, which was 83 school districts out of the 125 school districts on Long Island. So you had about 300,000 students represented in this survey. That's a little bit of the demographics that you'll understand as we go through the next few slides. This chart provides a 10-year look back at how many positions no longer exist or have been eliminated, largely driven by the tax cap legislation. So in many cases, you can see in 12-13, 13-14, you had very high job losses or positions that were eliminated through the tax cap. And you can see over a 10-year period, close to 5,000 positions have been eliminated across school districts that have responded to our budget impact survey. So this chart provides a little bit different look at that. And it discusses the impact that's kind of had on the economy because it talks about positions that have been accessed. So this is really when a staff member has lost their actual job. And you can see there was the highest year was the 12-13 year. And you could see that trend has stayed fairly stable over the last 5 to 6 years. But over the last 10, there's been 2,400 individuals who have had their jobs eliminated. And then what I find interesting with data that we've received from the impact survey is how many positions have been restored. So you can see in the current school year, you have a lot of positions that have been added back into school districts' budgets, which makes a lot of sense because you had unprecedented amount of federal funds that came to school districts. You can see the largest area of adding additional position are the low wealth school districts, which makes sense because the largest federal program, remember, was based on Title I allocations, which are focused on low wealth students. So some of the positions that were added, or many of the positions that were added, were in connection with special education, in some cases new program, so sometimes to reduce class size, and a big focus also on mental health services. This chart provides a look at positions needed to comply with Part 154, which is the education plan to meet the needs of English language learners. And what you can see here is that there's a much higher need with low wealth or middle wealth districts than in the wealthier school districts. So in the past year, you can see about 43% of the additional positions of the positions to address Part 154 were added into the low wealth and mid wealth categories. I'm sorry, in just the low wealth category, not the mid wealth category. A couple additional quick facts related to the budget survey that I just wanted to take a couple minutes to highlight. So there have been 74 positions were added to address student mental health needs. So this has been a significant focus on school districts to help address some of the needs of our students during the pandemic. There was a lot of isolation that occurred. Not all of the normal activities took place. And you can see much more support is needed in the school district level to help children through this time. That was a focus of the federal dollars as well, and resources that have been well spent to support these students. Also, instructional opportunities have been added in 53% of the responding school districts, right? So that's just increased program, new opportunities for our students to take additional classes or activities that may occur before or after school. Also, what we've observed from the budget impact survey for the 21-22 school year are a considerable amount of new pre-K programs. So this extends and doesn't start school at kindergarten, but actually when the child is 4 years old. So many school districts in recent years have added this program. It's more formalized in the school system, and it also has a nice benefit for parents who are often able to save money, or for other parents who may otherwise not have a student in a program prior to the start of school. Technology upgrades have been a major focus in school district budgets for obvious reasons, right? A lot of one-to-one technology initiatives have taken place, as well as upgrading the network that supports that. Significant capital upgrades have taken place with these federal dollars and plans to be in place. Many of those, as I mentioned before, focusing on increasing the ventilation and filtration of the air in the classrooms. Also, certain school districts reduced the tax levy, which helps property owners from the very high taxes that are paid on Long Island. And some increase the amount of funds that they put in their reserves. Reserves are basically very specific savings accounts for areas that schools are allowed to save money for, as provided under general municipal law. So we've analyzed some of the impacts that it's had for school districts. So how did this impact BOCES? So really how it works is when school districts have more funds, they're able to utilize the services from BOCES. And if there's reductions in school district budgets, they often pull back from the BOCES programs. So we have seen increased enrollment in our career tech education programs. We've seen increased enrollment with our special education programs, and we've seen increased participation in many of our other cooperative services, especially ones related to technology and technology acquisition programs. So those are some of the programs that we're seeing significant increases in. So if we shift for a minute and we take a look at, okay, so we had these federal programs that have definitive timelines that are going to come to an end during the 23-24 school year. What does that look more long-term or into the future for us? So we're always very focused and we're cautiously optimistic about the long-term stability of New York State funding for public education. There has been a commitment to fully fund foundation aid, which is the largest aid category for public education. And we are hopeful that the state can make that happen. The New York State does budget forecasts as well. They have recent information and provided recent projections where they're actually doing better than they anticipated they would be doing at this point in time, which is good news for our students that participate in our programs. But as we look at this, and as I mentioned, the loss of federal dollars and the potential of that happening is very real. So we know in the 23-24 school year that these federal dollar programs will expire. And the question is what happens afterwards? And then the last piece that we're always pay attention to in New York, believe it or not, is how long does it take for New York City to recover? So as we know, since the pandemic has started, many businesses have moved out of New York City, or people have moved out of New York City into other areas and sometimes into other states. And when this happens, you don't have the same level of tax revenues for collection in the New York State tax budget. So what is the impact of New York City? Will New York City be able to recover as the economic engine for New York State? And when this happens, will the state's budgets be able to stay on pace with their budget projections and fulfill the promise of fully funding foundation aid? So these factors all impact, or these factors could all lead to a potential funding cliff that we're paying very close attention to and taking steps to prepare now. So just in conclusion, as we take a look at some of the points that we made, and we'll have time for any questions that you have, is, we look at and we appreciate school districts receiving a historical amount of money from New York State and the federal government. If you participate in our advocacy program, certainly a thank you to our elected officials for making this happen. It is well-deserved. We do know that New York State aid was driven by federal dollars. So is the budget able to stand up on it by itself without that federal backing? Should advocacy look different? Should we focus also on federal elected officials as well as New York State elected officials? So that's something to consider. This aid is allowed school districts to provide more opportunities for students, which is good, especially during a pandemic. The state has promised to fully fund foundation aid, which is a program that goes back many, many years and has been cut repeatedly. New York State budget is an annual event, so we're always know that there are no guarantees for us moving forward, but that's why we pay close attention to these things and we follow it very, very carefully. So with that, that concludes my PowerPoint, but I would be more than happy to take any questions that you may have. I know, riveting topic, right? Riveting topic.
Ryan, you mentioned the potential funding cliff. Do you feel the fully funded foundation aid will be part of that cliff?
Yes. So, I mean, a bold move was made last year during the state budget process. It really, in my mind, came a little bit out of left field. If they are able to do that, it will take a lot of pressure off from school district budgets and property taxes as well, because it's dollars, but it's dollars coming from a different source. If they are not able to do that because their projections fall below what they need or federal dollars aren't there to help backfill it, that will absolutely lead to a funding cliff for school districts and cause a lot of problems for school budgets.
We also know if there has been increased enrollment in our component school districts right now for the start of the school year.
Yes, we haven't had that data come through just yet. I think last week was what's referred to as Beds Day. But this past week, I did speak with the transportation provider for the Brentwood School District, and enrollment there has seen some significant increases. But we're still trending it for this year, and it's early in the year for us to get those numbers. So, enrollment trends tend to be in certain school districts, your Brentwood, Central Islip, Riverhead schools, and then other school districts are seeing significant decline in enrollment. Some of those districts would be more like your Three Village, Sachem for many years have had declining enrollments. So it's different in different places.
Thank you.
Ryan, the BOCES do a lot of lobbying, and I shouldn't say the BOCES do a lot of lobbying, but we have a student advocacy group that likes to go to Albany and help lobby to support school districts and BOCES. Is there something that they should be lobbying for this year when it comes to funding and an eye to the future?
Yeah, I would start off with a thank you and an appreciation. I've never seen increases like I've seen this past year for public education. So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't spend the first couple of minutes really extending our appreciation and the recognition for the need. I also think the story is different in every single school district. So a continued focus on low wealth districts. They're the ones with a significant amount of need, ones that have considerable increased enrollment. They need support because as your number of students go up, you need the ability within a tax cap to have additional revenues come in. And often the only way to do that is through state aid. It's frequent that we see more of the higher wealth districts have declining enrollment, which creates inherent savings for those districts, right? If they have a couple elementary teachers retire in a year, they don't necessarily have to fill those positions because they've lost students through the years. So they made a commitment last year for foundation aid. I would make sure that we hold them to that commitment. If they're able to deliver on that, we will see another year of very, very large increases. And then just maintaining that level of commitment for foundation aid will continue a really steady income level for school districts that will be very, very helpful. So I gave a long answer, but to really sum it up, thank you. I would go with advocating for, maintaining the promise of full foundation aid, and then also really focusing on the lower wealth school districts to make sure that they're getting some of the resources to address significant needs that they're seeing with their students that they are educating.
I wanted to know, are there currently any clubs or programs available through the BOCES programs that students are aware of for mental health? I am aware that throughout COVID and everything like that, our mental health has degraded mostly, and most of percentage of students have also developed.
Ashley, are you still there? I lost you after develop. It was a great question.
Yes, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm aware that most of them have developed a lot of anxiety and depression going back to school and everything like that. So I just wanted to know if there's any resources throughout the BOCES program that many students should be aware of, that they can go and seek help in our local schools.
Yes, we do have a lot of extra programs at the building. I would encourage you to speak directly with your principal, and you should be able to, they will be able to direct you, or your teacher will be able to direct you to those programs. And if there's a case where there isn't a program, it's a good opportunity for you to advocate for a program to be considered. So in our CTE building, sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge because of the timing of the school day. But in our special education programs, where we have students for a longer period of time, I know those opportunities can exist.
Thank you. I would definitely look more into that. I would love to advocate for such a great program like that.
So now you have homework for tonight to remind yourself to go tomorrow.
Yes, most definitely.
Thanks so much for your question, Ashley.
Thank you.
Any other questions for tonight? All right, Colleen, now it's your opportunity. So Colleen's our Director of Business Services. She's going to fact check me now. So Colleen, so how did I do? Did I misstate anything?
A+.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, get 100.
Okay.
So as Director of Business Services, that means Colleen is actually the one responsible to build the BOCES budget, which is a massive, really complex budget. One of the things that Ryan spoke about in his presentation is this coalition, right? This Long Island Education Coalition, which has been around for many, many years. And he talked a little bit about the people who are at that table, right? They meet monthly, the fact that there's school business officials represented and there's school superintendents represented and PTAs represented, but and school board members represented. But there's also New York State United Teachers represented. So all of the people who really have a heart for public education and what's happening with it and how it's funded and how to communicate to elected officials and other people who are in position of kind of to control things that happen to public education. So every month that group gets together and meets and talks about really all of the issues that are going on with education. And it's a beautiful thing to watch all of those different groups be able to, or people from all of those different groups be able to talk about those things and really partner on some of the hard things that are happening around education. And, like very often every year, it's about school funding, the fact that, they support this annual survey of school districts to say, okay, like how
I got
did
pushed outside of the map by the brigade threw me through a wall.
just to see how it is that the state funding to schools has really impacted Long Island schools. And the fact that I think, as Ryan said, this is our 11th year, I think, of surveying and getting that information it's really a lot of helpful information, and we share it out. So that survey, believe it or not, the work for that survey happens at Eastern Suffolk BOCES. Dr. Pat McCabe, who is on this phone call, does much of the number crunching of those survey results, along with the support in her office. And it's used throughout advocacy season for school districts to be able to talk to elected officials about how the budget has impacted them. So one of the things that BOCES does, and Ryan supports that work, is help districts know how to advocate for themselves, right? We don't just advocate for BOCES, we advocate for the 51 districts that are ours, the 69 districts in Suffolk County, and actually the 125 school districts on Long Island. So we are well known for those advocacy efforts. They are supported by our board. And some students, have seen the different events that we have or that we're part of to do that advocacy. So just something to know that as an organization, we don't just provide education, but we provide support to school districts to get the money that they need.
And Julie, we do have a question in the chat from Amanda. So it says, can you talk about how education will look like for the graduating classes of 2025 and beyond? So that, believe it or not, is very much a challenge to do. So often when we do financial forecasts, we go out 3 and sometimes 5 years. But by the time you get to years 4 and 5, it's really based on a lot of assumptions. So it's not always too accurate, but still a useful practice for us to do. It will be largely indicated on the level of opportunities and programs at the state's commitment that they've made related to foundation aid. Also, if there's increases or backfills that happen after these federal programs expire, that would help to keep the funding level at a good rate. Also, just the economy in general will have an impact on funds that are available. Something that we're taking a look at too, which I'm trying to get too into the finances, but is just inflation in general. So that's the cost of what inflation represents, is how expensive things are today versus what they were maybe last year at this time, or even in last month. So little things that you don't think about just generally cost more. And I think there was a recent report that came out earlier this week that talks about, I think the dollar was around $175 per month per household, is just the cost for families to buy the things that would normally buy, such as gasoline or groceries or clothing, heating for the home or electricity. So inflation not only impacts families, but also it can impact school districts. So school districts are trying to run in a world where their budget is capped by a tax cap, which is often close to 2%. And each dollar is worth a little bit less. So inflation is also a little bit of a concern for school districts and BOCES as we look into the future. So unfortunately, I'm not really able to answer your question. It is a really good question, but it depends on a lot of different factors that we're all watching and paying close attention to. But we're hopeful. I think there was a strong statement made by the United States government to make sure that there was just historic amounts of revenue that was provided to every school district in the country. And to me, that sends a bigger message that they understand the importance of public education and the importance that that has on the greater economy and really the fabric to our society as a whole. So I have great hope for classes of 2025 and beyond.
Any other questions that people have for Ryan about funding or programs or really anything related to the BOCES budget? It's been a very interesting year, and coming off a year, right, when we were in a pandemic year, there were districts who didn't think they were going to be able to make the budget that they put together for that year, right? The state had withheld some funding to school districts for a short amount of time. So there was a tremendous amount of unknowns and angst on top of COVID. So to have that followed up by this next year with all of this extra funding, and a lot of it came very late in the budget cycle, right, with some pretty short timelines as to when districts needed to figure out how to expend it. So as Ryan said, there is this unknown, right? Are they really going to make good on their promise? What happens when the federal money goes away? And the fact that much of it went to districts that had been, in their eyes, shortchanged money. So districts that had a lot of needs got a lot of money. And really some of them were scrambling to put a plan into place to spend that money. But it really has allowed districts to do things that they had not been able to do. And some of that is, provide mental health services or social emotional support for their students, as consistent with an earlier question. So any other questions that people have?
I actually have a little question. Before, you mentioned a lot of the budget or some of the budget monies and forecasting. We look at New York City in terms of what goes on there. Is that almost like implying that some of our or Long Island district tax dollars might not be coming back to us because we're trying to balance off, such a draw in New York City? Is that one of the reasons why we look to them besides businesses moving in and out?
Yeah, so really the way a very large percentage, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but a large percentage of the state's budget is based on revenues that are received from New York City. And a lot of that's obviously connected with the financial district and Wall Street, and in many cases, year-end bonuses. So you'll often hear if there's a good year on the stock market, there's higher year-end bonuses, which means higher payment of taxes, which means New York State gets a lot more money, which means they're able to send more money to school districts for public education. The dollars on Long Island that we pay in income taxes are also utilized to support other regions of the state, but not nearly at the same percentage that you see coming from New York City. Obviously, there's a lot more people who work and live in New York City. And as you go further north, there's less and less income and wealth, and it's more rural, and their challenges are very significant. So it wouldn't necessarily impact what happens with our dollars, but it has an impact across the state as a whole. And that's why when we looked at projections, we do kind of pay attention to what's happening in the city. And we do have reasons to pause and just be a little concerned, because we've all heard stories of, you know, so-and-so used to go into the city every day. But now they moved to North Carolina because they found out that they can do their job just as easily from in the office, you know, to, you know, their home office. I've heard that story quite a bit. And every time those individuals, often highly paid individuals, move out of state, that is less revenue for the state. And it also depends, obviously, on where those businesses then locate, right? So if they realize they don't have to pay the high rents of New York City and they can go elsewhere, it also has an impact.
So now with remote businesses, you think that's going to be an even bigger problem? Because now people realize they don't have to pay the brick and mortar rents. So will they eventually bounce back? Is probably one of the questions, right?
Yeah, I believe it is, you know, based on some of the articles that I've read recently, they are starting to see the signs of it coming back. But will it return to the levels that it once was, I think is the real question.
Thank you.
Any other questions that anybody has?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts on school finances and what it's looked like during the pandemic. I really appreciate it. And if something comes up afterwards, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and I'll be more than happy to have a conversation with you or answer your question.
Good. Thank you very much, Ryan. Bill, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for your presentation tonight. As we recap, the next meeting will be Thursday, November 4th at 7 o'clock. We will have guest speaker legislator Sarah Anker of District 6 of Suffolk County.
Good. Thank you, everybody. Have a great long weekend coming
Bye,
up.
everybody.
Stay safe and be well.
Have a happy holiday weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.